was the summer before my senior year in high school, and one of those perfect summer nights where the sky is incredibly clear and the air is still hot but comfortable. My dad and I were heading out to pick up my younger sister from a friend's house on the other side of town. We live right on the edge of town, and our house is in an older suburban neighborhood. Our back fence literally sits on the city limit line, so it has a very rural feel. The drive started off quietly, and I was so happy to be driving my new car. It was an older 2005 Nissan, but it was new to me, and it was my first car. I loved it. My high school was only a minute or two down the road from our house, and as we passed it on the left, we were both looking at the massive housing development that was being built all year on the other side of the road to our right. A lot of the houses were already finished and occupied, and my dad broke the silence when he pointed to one of the new homes, asking what this group of people was doing on their back deck. There was a whole family standing outside on their porch, staring up into the sky and pointing. We could see their faces because they had those large outside lights hanging around their entire deck. My dad and I were both looking around at what they might be pointing at but didn't see a thing. There's a very large park across the street with mature pine trees, and we couldn't see anything past the trees. The moon was out but behind the housing development, so I know they weren't looking at that. My dad and I both thought it looked a little weird, but in less than a minute we had already forgotten about it. About 15 minutes later, we were at my sister's friend's house to pick her up. My sister is the polar opposite of me. I remember her bursting out of the door as loud, social, and energetic as usual. She yelled goodbye to her friends, jumped into the back seat, barely stopping to buckle up, and immediately launched into a detailed recap of her day. She's a hilarious person, and the drive back was anything but quiet. She had my dad and I both laughing, and it was just fun knowing it was summer. As we got back over to our side of town, right at the newly built homes we'd passed earlier, our conversation was interrupted when we noticed a patch of fog or dust on the road ahead of us. We didn't really think that much about it other than it was odd, especially since it was the middle of summer and the sky was completely clear. I asked my dad out loud if he was seeing the fog, and he just quietly said, "Yeah, that is really weird." We were just blocks from my school, and there are streetlights and a big roundabout there, but this fog was still along the dark part of the road and next to the park. I just kept driving and went right into the fog. It seemed extremely dense, and all I could see was a foot or two of bright yellow and white lines in front of me. I remember almost immediately my heart started racing. Just seconds after driving into it, these stark, white, vertical shafts of light appeared in front of my car. They were thin beams of light, only about 5 or 6 inches wide, and they were moving from one side to the other. There was no oncoming traffic and no streetlights, so it seriously startled me. I felt a sudden warmth at the back of my head and a pulsing feeling in my chest. The edges of my vision got darker, and a wave of dizziness hit me hard like I might pass out. Just a second after that, I noticed my legs tingling and my feet felt numb. I remember saying out loud, "Dad, something's wrong." He looked at me and asked if I was okay, but I could tell he was concerned too, which made it even worse. I didn't hear a single sound from my sister and almost forgot she was there. I looked in my rearview mirror and I could see that those vertical beams of light were not only in front of the car, but behind us now too. All I wanted to do was get out of the fog because we couldn't see anything else in any direction, and it was becoming claustrophobic. I remember pushing the gas pedal all the way to the floor, something I'd never done as a newer driver, but I didn't know what else to do. The engine revved up higher than I'd ever heard it, and in just a few short seconds we came out the other side and it was crystal clear again. The sensations I was feeling stopped as abruptly as they'd started. The buzzing in my head was gone, my legs felt normal, and I didn't feel lightheaded anymore. The first thing I heard was my sister asking us what that was. I told her I didn't know, but she had to have seen my hands shaking and noticed I was going way over the speed limit to get home. My dad was also talking about what had just happened, but to be honest, I didn't hear a word he said. As we turned onto our road, only a couple minutes later, I finally eased up on the steering wheel and started to calm down a little. We pulled into our driveway, and the three of us just sat in silence for a moment. My dad finally said, "We need to tell Mom," so we all got out of the car and went inside. When we got in the house, we relayed the whole story to her, every detail about the fog, the lights, the strange sensations that made me dizzy and made my legs numb, and the group of people out on their decks staring and pointing at something in the sky exactly where this all happened. My dad even suggested going back to see if it was still there, but I couldn't bring myself to say yes. I didn't even feel fully comfortable being back at home, only a mile or so away from it. That night it was hard for me to sleep. I texted a couple of friends about what had happened and ended up keeping my TV on all night, which I never do. It was weeks before I felt comfortable driving down that road again, even in the daytime. I knew I'd have to drive on it daily when school started, so eventually I started going that direction again. Whatever we experienced that night was more than just an odd patch of fog, and the feelings that hit me were so sudden and disturbing. Later that year, when I was back in school, I ended up writing a paper about it for one of my classes just to get it all out and on paper. It's the strangest thing I've ever experienced, and I'll forever wonder what actually happened to us. I'm a forest ranger at Great Smoky National Park. For the most part, my shifts are predictable, other than the occasional group of campers who push the rules or wildlife encounter that gets too close for comfort. This particular encounter happened to me late in the evening in September of 2018. I was patrolling the Alum Cave trail, a trail I know very well. It's surrounded by old-growth hemlock and birch. It has incredible views, and it's one of the most popular hikes in the park. The park is a different place after the sun goes down, though. The woods feel dense and the air cools down quickly. That night, it was completely clear out and the moon was bright enough to walk most of the trail without my flashlight. The temperature was mild, around 50 degrees, and there was enough of a breeze that I could hear the leaves blowing. Everything was good on the trail so far, and I remember thinking how peaceful it was. I had just passed Arch Rock, which is a natural rock formation that always looks a little creepy at night, when something caught my eye off to the left of the trail. It was a light, just hanging there beyond the tree line, like 100 feet away. I stopped and started squinting to try and see what it was. It wasn't moving like a flashlight or lantern would with a person's steps. It was perfectly still and round and was lighting up the nearby branches and leaves. At first, I thought it was a late hiker that had gone off trail, so I asked out loud if anyone needed help. My voice echoed a little, but I didn't get a response. I didn't even see the light move or react to my voice. It was just staying there, about 4 feet off the ground. I cautiously took a few steps closer and heard my boots crunching the dry leaves, which now seemed 10 times as loud to me. The light shifted then, not moving toward or away from me, but to the side, like it was aware of me and wanted to keep its distance. I stopped again, and so did the light. It almost felt like we were sizing each other up. Everything around was still normal. I could hear the wind in the trees and crickets chirping, but no other sounds that could give me an idea of what was back there. I reached for my radio to call in about what I was seeing, but when I pressed the button, all I got was a light static. I walked backward a little and slightly up the trail, but I must have been out of range, which was odd because my radio has always worked fine on that trail. I stayed where I was, still holding the radio, and saw the light move again, this time along the edge of the trees, keeping that same distance between us. It seemed to be moving deliberately, like it knew I was there, but it wanted to keep its own boundary. I didn't get the feeling it was moving randomly or drifting in the wind or anything like that. It felt intentional. I thought about walking a little closer to it, but there was something that kept me rooted to the spot I was in. I was starting to wonder if someone had strapped a light to an animal because it was behaving in that kind of way, where it seemed to stay just out of reach. Minutes must have gone by as I stood there, watching it move in slow, careful arcs, always staying parallel to where I was. I tried the radio one more time, but it was still useless. Finally, after what must have been 10 full minutes, the light moved quickly back into the woods like it had decided it was done with me. It darted off to the right into the deeper trees with a kind of precision that was unsettling. The weirdest part was that I didn't hear a sound when it took off. I didn't hear branches snapping or leaves crunching or stomping on the ground or anything. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. If it was some kind of animal, there is no way it could have run off like that without making any noise. As soon as it disappeared, I decided the best idea would be to head back down the trail to my truck. I kept wondering if it could have been a black bear or a deer that had somehow gotten a light wrapped around its neck, but that still wouldn't explain how quiet it was the whole time, especially when it went back into the trees. It was lighting up things around it too, so I feel like I would have seen the side or head of an animal if that's what it was. I remember keeping my flashlight on the entire hike back to the truck because I was feeling a little nervous. The only thing I did before leaving was a quick check of the trailhead restrooms, then headed out. When I got back to the ranger station, I told my supervisor the story and gave him a location, time, etc. He jotted down some notes in a logbook for things like this, but oddly didn't seem too surprised. Apparently, there have been other reports of strange lights in the park, but not exactly like the light I saw. I didn't get a sense he wanted to do anything about it, and when he was done writing, he just thanked me for reporting it. I've been on that trail dozens of times since, and every now and then I'll stop at the same spot to look around in the trees. It only happened the one time, but I'd really love to know what that was. It's almost annoying to me that I still don't have an explanation. I've been hiking and backpacking for most of my adult life, and every spare minute that I'm not forced to be at work is spent outside. A few summers ago, I decided to do a 3-day solo trip on the Hidden Lake Trail in the North Cascades. If you know that area, you know how ridiculously beautiful it is with lush forests, alpine meadows, and towering peaks everywhere. It's not called the American Alps for nothing. My plan was to push up the main trail, then take a scrambler route around Hidden Lake Peak to set up camp somewhere on Hidden Lake. The first day, I left my car at the trailhead and started heading up the trail. It starts out lower and in the forest, then opens up as you get higher in elevation. I was in my zone, just me and the sound of my shoes on the rocky path. I walked around to Hidden Lake and found a perfect flat spot with an incredible view. By the time I got my tent set up and had something to eat, the sun was already setting behind the ridge. The temperature drops fast up there, so I climbed into my sleeping bag and listened to the wind and the lake until I dozed off. The next day, I hiked up Hidden Lake Peak where there's a cool little fire watch hut at the summit, and also did another trail from there that I think is called North Peak. I can't remember. I was just taking my time and checking out some of the amazing viewpoints because you can see so much. When I got back to camp, I cooked up dinner and watched the sky go from light to dark. I got about an hour of headlamp reading in while lying in my tent, then went to bed. That night I was sleeping pretty deeply when I woke up to answer nature's call. I glanced at my phone and remember clearly it said 2:36 a.m. It was cold and I wanted to make it quick. I stepped out of my tent, letting my eyes adjust a little, and then looked up at Hidden Lake Peak. Instantly, I noticed a group of small lights just above the peak, like right above it, moving around in ways that didn't make any sense. They were red and white and zipping around in sharp, angular motions like insects would. 1 second they'd be in one spot, and then they'd jump across the sky in a split second, then pause and do it again. I was having a hard time understanding what I was seeing because I was still waking up. I've seen a lot of stuff out in the mountains, from satellites, planes, and helicopters, to the occasional annoying drone when I'm unfortunately too close to some Instagram influencer. But these lights were different. They were tiny and silent. I didn't even pee, I just stood there watching these things fly around the top of the peak. My very first thought, of course, was to get a video. I reached in the tent and grabbed my phone, but as soon as I started recording a video, it was having focusing issues. I kept touching the screen to try and get it to focus on the peak or the sky, but I think it was so dark that it wasn't able to lock onto anything. Now frustrated, I switched my phone over to the regular photo mode and blasted off at least a dozen photos. That did work because my phone switched into this night mode, but the photos just look like slightly red stars in the sky over the peak. They're not impressive at all, and for sure don't show what the lights really looked like or the crazy way they were flying around. The lights kept going, darting in close to the peak, then back out away from it, almost like they were searching for something. It was so weird. I kept straining my ears for any sound but didn't hear a thing. I stood there for like 10 minutes, maybe more. I wasn't even thinking about how cold I was or that I still needed to go to the bathroom pretty badly. Then I noticed a few of them fly over the peak and out of sight. After the first few lights did that, the rest followed, and just like that, they were all gone and had flown somewhere behind the peak and out of my view. Then it was just me, standing there in my boxer shorts and a light down coat, and nothing. I stayed out for a while longer, looking around at the sky and hoping to see more, but that was the end of it. I finally crawled back into my tent, now wide awake, and laid there thinking about it. There was no way I'd be able to get back to sleep after that, so I grabbed my book and started reading again, occasionally unzipping the window to look up. I did that until dawn, then got up, packed up my gear, and headed back down to my car. It was earlier than I'd planned on leaving that day, but I was tired and really just confused about the whole thing. I've told this story to so many friends since it happened, and even had a couple that I climb with do almost the same backpacking trip in the same spot, but they didn't see anything on their trip. It didn't scare me at all, and I'd love to go back up there for another solo trip one of these days. I'm so curious about what those things were. The way they were moving and the speed they were going and stopping was just insane. So, that's my story. I don't know what it was, but it's something I bring up often and still think about whenever I head out alone. It's like this little reminder that nature, as familiar as it feels, can still throw something at you that's totally beyond what you're prepared for.